So I know you're keen to know the results of an interesting process. So Dr. Vishwanath spent 38 years preparing the talk that we heard before the workshop, working with quite a lot of individuals and organizations to understand what the concept of collaborative community-based stewardship of water might mean. And I was personally just amazed by the new elements of the story I heard in his talk compared to when I last looked at his website. So there's things moving very quickly. It's almost the kind of the epitome of the multi-dimensional, not just in terms of subjects covered, but by time scales, the social, the engineering, the urban. And so the prospect that you would all instantly in 40 minutes turn that into a perfect synthesis was probably not very realistic, but that's not kind of what we were expecting. As far as I'm concerned, we wanted you to kind of be gripped by the possible ways into the story. So if you remember, Vishwanath towards the end had a list of number of items called ways to intervene in a system from Donella Meadows. One way to think about our work in these days is not that we come up with a unified theory of change in each subject, but that we identify person to person, organization to organization, where we might intervene in a particular system. So in terms of the collaborative stewardship and management, if that's the word, of water, it's not that you have to kind of look for the correct answer, we know that, but look for an angle of intervention of the multiple stories that we heard from Vishwanath. And in that spirit, I'll just read out the main bits, but I mean, quite frankly, you can see there's an incredible amount of points being put onto each person's canvas. So I'm not going to attempt to kind of make a sort of synthesis, but just read out the highlights. And then I hope you'll take the time over the next days to kind of browse it in a more leisurely way. So I think I'm correct in saying that this whiteboard will physically go into the exhibition area to join the other boards, which, to remind you, already contain the work that many of you do here, as well as the student projects to do with putting multiple realities into a small cube. Anyway, I'm just going to read out the statements, I think, as best I can do here, and then just to say there's a lot of browsing to be done for those of you who do good at that. So this says, follow the 5 C's to improve the collection and management of water. The 5 C's being consumption, community, cost, control, and various other C words. You can read your own, yes. Follow the 5 C's. I think there's 7 C's there, just to confuse matters further. Here, I apologize. This says, which technological tools could improve the care of water systems? This is the same question, and it says, behavioral and cultural change enabled by technology in order to address inequity, people and political will, it has to start at home, kitchen, school. So it's about where you start intervening in a system. I think that's about an infinity of possible ways to go into this story, but starting what I said at the beginning, and I keep repeating, practical acts of care, where you can actually experience improving something, however tiny, that they begin to connect together. This group has no discipline and has covered up its statement. So this group is called this is technology tools again, and so right stakeholders, making the knowledge equitable, question the position of the expert. So lots of statements about the nature of the inquiry and how one would intervene in the system, as well as where to start, for example, at the household or the school, who to start with. Don't just be told by experts what to do. This is the same question. Creating community consciousness using data about usage, practices, feedbacks, includes the awareness practices and programs by resident organizations, tech interventions to enforce the guidelines by corporations. In other words, don't be passive users of data, be involved in collecting your own data about how water is used in your communities. This is true in many parts of the world now, that when people become active collectors of data as well as just analyzing it, transforms your relationship to what can be done. I've known that from other places. This is a new question, which people or departments in government are potential project partners. Lots of very neatly written lists, very well done on your handwriting, this group. And it says, design interconnected and collaborative of water cycle across the landscapes involving community at the center of it. So in other words, yes, look for government partners at different levels, like municipalities or whatever, state, region, nation, but make the community at the center of that. It's not the community, it's like the recipient of whatever from governments, but the governments are the collaborators in that process. If I'm wildly misrepresenting you, tell me later. Examples of successful community co-ownership to learn from: designing active relationship with water, engage with water. So, okay, we can go with that. Examples: people have to drive it, by the people, for the people. Planetary concerns. So that is indeed, it's a big picture. Water is everywhere, water is everything, but we have to start somewhere, and we don't just start with a concept or an idea, but people in a place that are going to be actors of place-based acts of care for some aspect of water, however tiny. Examples of community co-ownership to learn from: activities around children to enable them to learn and impart knowledge around water origins, history, resource and usability. Belonging. Starting with children is never a bad thing. Children often know more than we have. They haven't been educated to death. So yeah, good advice. And the last one, not so proud of the handwriting here. Which people or departments in governments are potential project partners? Influence individual departments and their intersections with small, easy, impactful, hyper-local interventions designed around multifunctional groups of water custodians. Very good advice. Don't say government in general. Find individuals who are open to collaborating. Design projects and interventions with those individuals. Frame and use the language that gets them through the system, but don't start at the government. Great work, teams. Thank you. I'm not going to take questions at this point because I think go and look at this at your leisure a bit later. I think we should move on to the next subject, unless there are any practical questions about the process at the moment after this round. Did you feel you had a chance to be heard in general? It's kind of a crazy task, I know, but you're not panicking about being ignored or left silent in the corner? No. Okay, good. Would you like to remove item evidence 1 from the... So the second framework that we wanted to get your inputs on is the subject of mobility, although I must say I've played a bit tricky with this one because I don't know about you, but I've spent a lot of my life talking to mobility experts who, in general, think they know how to do mobility. So we're taking a slightly different angle, which is that supposing that the age of infinitely expanding mobility is coming to an end, and that the question is not so much how can we build more vehicles, or how can we build more infrastructures, or how can we build more layers of information to make mobility more and more intense, more ubiquitous, and more easy. Suppose, for the sake of argument, we're moving to an era in which mobility is no longer the logic which drives development, has been the case in the last 50 or 60 years. I used to think that was one of my dreamers in my capacity as somebody who wasn't responsible for car factories or people's jobs, but just somebody who was observing how things could be different. But in the last period of time, I've seen some extraordinarily persuasive signals of change, which I think the notion of peak car is not just an idea, but is real. So 4 examples. Last week, there was a panic press conference from the European Commission about the fact that all the car companies in Europe are operating at less than 50% of the capacity that they have for production. Less than 50%. And when I say car companies, I'm thinking of quite large chunks of the German economy, for example. Tens of thousands of companies all over the world feeding that system. So just think of it, if it's running at less than 50% capacity now, despite incredible efforts to restart economies and so on after COVID, that's, I think, a signal of something very dramatic happening to the mobility economy as such. Secondly, Los Angeles, I don't know if anybody saw the Olympics. Los Angeles, which is the most car-based city in the world, announced that the Olympics of 2028 are going to be the world's first car-free Olympics. Did you notice that, anybody? How and whatever that means, I have no idea. But for LA to say that signals something very profound in terms of how people think about modernity and development. And I'll just stop on my third example, which is I'm going to China shortly. Does anybody here go to China in their work? Have you been to China? In China, there are no white vans to speak of on the streets of Chinese cities. The entire logistics system of millions upon millions of vehicle movements that keep water, food, and all provisions have been migrated onto basically electric scooters of one sort or another and different forms of distribution models, radically reducing the amount of matter being physically carted around the city. I mean, I can't promise you that this is some kind of a transformational change, but it looks pretty amazing to me as somebody goes to quite a few cities. Where are the vans gone? So if the vans are gone, vans represent mass and something very profound. So this is my excuse for the next two presentations, because I thought, we're not going to talk about autonomous vehicles, we're not going to talk about the importance of the car industry to India's economy, which of course I'm sure is true. We're going to talk about what happens in a world in which mobility and the infrastructures of mobility are no longer the kind of top of the agenda, but where we have to think in different ways about how we inhabit cities, how we live in them in a less mobile way. What do we do with all the roads and the parking spaces and the infrastructures of cars if the cars are no longer there? No, so I'm pushing it a bit, but the next two speakers are going to provoke us into that area. So, Mick, are you going first, did I say? Yes. Mick Douglas, who's a professor at RMIT, but he's also a uniquely hybrid artist, creator, provocateur, and many, many things. He'll explain it. Just to say that I wanted to meet him again after he kind of totally blew my mind with a project called Tramjatra, comparing the tram systems of Melbourne and Calcutta, in which, as an artist, as a designer, as a whatever, he just got us to think about mobility not as a kind of technical system, but as a social space with incredible vitality and variability. So that's why I wanted to hear what Mick's been doing in the years since Tramjatra. So, Mick Douglas, please welcome to the stage.